Chris McCracken.
So, kind of like back in the day, a couple years ago when Apple and Epic were fighting in the courts, all this stuff came out. And we just got to learn things because
all the dirt.
They were in a fight, so we get to learn things. So it's a very similar situation, and there's way more things that have come out. And I work 9 to 5, so I don't get to just sit here and read all the things. But there's people like live tweeting the trial as it's going and all these kinds of things. So there's tons of things out there that you can go find out, and I'm sure we may have a little bit more information next week as well. But these are kind of some of the bigger high level things that came out from the last couple days that I'll touch on. So one of the things that got brought up was a 2019 email from Xbox Studios head Matt Booty, and he said that they could spin Sony out of business, quote. And then he said, he said, if we think that video game content matters in 10 years, we might look back and say totally worth it to have lost $2 to $3 billion in 2020 to avoid a situation where Tencent or Google or Amazon or even Sony becomes the Disney of games and owns most of the valuable content. And he basically went on to say that he said Sony's really the only other one that can compete with us with Game Pass. And right now we have a 2-year lead and 10 million subscriber lead in that situation. So essentially he was saying, like, let's do it. Let's open up the war chest. Let's just buy all the stuff. Not only will it fill our service, but it'll pretty much destroy any competition. We'll have such a far lead, kind of like how Netflix did in the streaming video days. That it'll not insurmountable, but it'll take a lot of time and effort. And as everybody has said numerous times, in fact, it's part of the reason that this whole trial is going on, is Microsoft has a lot of money and could just buy a lot of stuff.
They sure do.
And so the fact that he said this wasn't the greatest look. Microsoft just said that, hey, they were just spitballing. It was a thought experiment. It's not something that we're not trying to do that now. It has nothing to do with this current acquisition.
Right, blah, 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 but it does hurt that whole. What? No, we want you to play games where you want to play them.
Right.
That we're all a family of gamers, and we just want to present. I know, but then when the email comes out, because not every company's got their emails coming out. Like Chris saying, when the tea starts getting spilled all over the place, and I don't know if he's going to get into this, but start seeing who they were trying to buy and stuff like that, and saying something like spin them out of business. When you start saying, hey, we want to be Netflix and we want Sony to be Blockbuster, and we want them to, he's not saying he doesn't want them to not exist anymore, but he's just saying we don't want it to be close. We've got this lead. We want to be number one. And it gives a little validity to the fight, right? Because I've seen some people be like, man, why is Sony getting so sweaty about all this? And this is a fight, man. This is business.
Right.
And Sony's not the only one. They might just be the loudest. But there's a lot of companies that don't like what Microsoft would be doing.
Yeah.
And so I've kind of seen over this week that there's been other companies that have kind of come up and raised little flags to the FTC to keep the fight going on. It's not just Sony in the fight against Microsoft.
Yeah, I just,
so one other thing,
to me at least, it's one of those situations of, but if we were to scour through every correspondence that Sony did, I'm sure we'd be able to find
of course.
One thing, grab and pick one thing that was like just a conversation between two people. Oh man, if this happened, this would be crazy and blah, 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 blah. It's not their official stance. It's really hard to just cherry pick and, sure, the idea came across, but is he not allowed then to talk to someone else in the company about, does everything have to be an in-person, over lunch so you can't?
That's right.
There's no paper trail of any idea you had. I don't know.
I have no problems with that. Make those statements. I don't think that's probably something that should have been inter-business, but that happens all the time. So it's like, yeah, of course you want to be number one. Of course you want to outdo your competitors. And to be honest, they're kind of executing that plan. Like, they're buying a lot of things and they're getting a lot of, they're really, they're spending money and they're gathering assets. And if that's the ultimate goal, they're doing that. So any business would knock yourself out.
And I mean, shoot, I just went out and bought a Series X.
There you go.
You know what I'm saying? They doing something right in my book. And so I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
Right.
I'm just saying this is what happens when tea starts getting spilled all over the place.
It's good to be
that this stuff comes out. Yeah. Continue, Christopher.
there's been, I actually don't have it as part of this article that I'm pulling from Kotaku, but there was another one where early on in the trial, there was I believe it was an email from Jim Ryan to somebody else saying that he didn't really feel like Activision being bought was going to really impede like Call of Duty and other things being a part of PlayStation, which clearly had been flipped from later on, where he was saying like, hey, maybe it won't get pulled, but we think that it could possibly be pulled. And on top of that, we think we'll be getting the worst version and all these things. So it's not as though past comments are only looking bad on the Microsoft side. There's things on the opposition side that have come out that have been like, oh, this isn't a great look for your side of the case either.
And just for context, Jim Ryan is the CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment.
Right.
And I believe that's his actual title. So many places call him the president and then CEO.
Oh, really?
I think CEO is the actual thing. I think people have been saying president incorrectly, but I actually don't have that pulled up.
We'll say boss.
Oh, yeah.
We'll say boss. Yeah, I might
boss over at PlayStation.
One other thing that we did find out with part of this is that, so we know that this happened on the PlayStation side as well, but the Series X in particular was having a lot of shortages and time where people just couldn't get their hands on one. And we found out that, at least according to Spencer, that part of that was not just because it was difficult to get their hands on parts and sourcing things to build them, but that they also were doing a lot of huge investment in xCloud, and that so much of their efforts and expenses was focused over there that it caused the Xbox Series X to kind of have some problems being produced and come out. And essentially, Spencer was like, look, I'm fine with our strategy if we're doing, this is more of a long-term goal or long-term bet that we're doing right here. So I'm okay with Xboxes being hard to get right now while we really focus on the infrastructure over here to get our cloud gaming up, because that's going to pay more dividends in the future. And Xboxes will come around where they're much more plentiful. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see. Another one was there was a blog post whenever Microsoft had initially said that they were looking to buy Activision. And in this blog post, they kind of talked about how, you know, their commitment to keeping like Call of Duty and Diablo and Overwatch and games, a lot of the games that Blizzard and Activision make to be multi-platform. Well, at the time, Pete Hines, who is a representative of Bethesda, he was kind of surprised by this. And so he sent off an email to, I believe it was Phil Spencer. And he said, he said, quote, "I'm confused. Is this below not the opposite of what we were just asked/told to do with our titles? I understand this is, I understand that there is a likely nuance here, but at its core, it's being read as the opposite of what happened to us." Speaking to, their titles that were told like, hey, this is going to Starfield and Elder Scrolls and that are going to be
being exclusive.
Xbox exclusive. And then also it was found out that the Indiana Jones game, which is being made by Machine Games, who also made Wolfenstein, which falls under ZeniMax, was going to be multi-platform, got moved over to being console exclusive. And we had heard before through not necessarily this trial, but also the same thing was with Starfield. There's actually some information that came out in this that Starfield was looking at possibly being Sony exclusive, at least timed exclusive for a while, kind of like how Ghostwire Tokyo and what was I always forget the name of the time game, the rewind game. What was it that you guys really loved? Deathloop. Those were both timed exclusives on Sony before they opened up to being on Xbox. And those deals
Final Fantasy VII as well.
But I mean, I'm talking about Bethesda games that they owned.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm saying that games that they had, Sony was already in the works to possibly make a deal to make Starfield like a timed exclusive. And then once Microsoft bought them, they just squashed the multi-platform of that game and just decided to keep it PC and Xbox. Fallout 76 was not doing that great. Spencer was like, hey, we need to have 10 million monthly active users on this game. And so to kind of get them there, he's like, the people that he was talking with, they're like, if y'all feel like adding it to PlayStation Plus will help get us there, I'm supportive of that. It ended up coming to PlayStation Plus. Back then it was PS Now, got folded into the new version of PlayStation Plus. And now it has hit the goal and it's over 10,000 monthly active users. So that's kind of an area where a pro in their side of the case where they're like, hey, this is our goal. And so we were like, yeah, put it wherever to reach our goal. And they were able to reach their goal.
Yep.
And then down here at the bottom, I'll just go over, there was several different developers throughout this that they were considering possibly purchasing. and they kind of had like a pros and con list of several of them. One of them was Bungie, which clearly we know Sony ended up being the person who bought them.
Which would have been weird, considering they did own them at once.
Yeah, like, you know what I mean? Own them, let them go, and then own them again would have been weird.
Yeah, and it would have been weird, not just for the Microsoft side, right, because it's the dollars and cents, but it'd been weird from the Bungie side.
Yeah.
If Bungie was like, yeah, that's fine, because you don't just get bought. You know what I'm saying? Like you have, I would think somebody in there's got to say. It's the, you know what I'm saying? It's not like it's a piece of bread on the shelf and it doesn't get a vote whether it gets bought by you or not.
Yeah.
And so that would have been, when I saw that, I was like, Bungie? I was like, that would have been like the weirdest thing ever. Like, why did you get rid of it in the first place? So I'm glad that didn't happen.
It was interesting though, because in listing out these developers that they have interest in, they did kind of have like at least a short little pros and con list. And so for Bungie, they were like, they're a top tier AAA first person shooter and developer with a proven track record, but the con was the company is known for its high burn rate. So that's interesting. They also considered buying Housemarque, which again, Sony ended up buying.
I don't know if I know what high burn rate means.
I don't know. I don't have it in context with where the email was.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that means turnover rate in like talent. But I'm not 100% sure on that because I don't have the context here. They had considered making an offer to Housemarque. They thought that they had the ability to deliver a steady flow of content for Game Pass, but the con was Housemarque has a very extensive relationship with Sony. And I assume the context there is that they probably wouldn't be interested because they want to continue to work with Sony, who's done really well for them. They thought about buying Remedy, who was
Housemarque did Returnal, Resogun. Just for context for somebody who might not just know.
Several of their games have been
Housemarque.
Exclusive to PlayStation properties over the years. Even though they've always, up until Sony bought them, had always been independent. They'd considered buying Remedy, who everybody knows who Remedy is and has a lot of AAA narrative games. But they said a negative is that their next two games are tied to the Epic Game Store. So interesting that was considered a con whenever they still bought Bethesda, even though they knew that several of these games were tied to PlayStation.
Yeah.
Of course, those deals were probably way different in scope. Bethesda probably was way more expensive and brought way more to the table, but it was still an interesting way to see that. Playdead Studios, who made Limbo and Inside, they said they've known for their critically acclaimed successful games, but the con was long development times, and the projects end up being relatively short experiences. So it's just kind of interesting. There's several other developers in here, some that are a little bit less in the big name stuff, but it's interesting to see kind of like, it's just interesting to see it like in a pros con list, kind of like that. Like,
did they have one for Sega?
They did. It's not part of this. They just mentioned that they were looking at possibly buying Sega. Obviously, there's a ton of IP there that could like fill up Game Pass super quickly.
Yeah.
And then obviously Sega continues to make things, so it would just be a steady stream of things with Game Pass. I did not see what the reason why they didn't end up ultimately making the offer.
Yeah, also, I just didn't know if they're
trying to get into the whole mobile side as well. One of the other things is and we knew this before, that they were looking at possibly buying Zynga in the past, and then they got gobbled up by somebody else, by Tencent, I think, or somebody. So just lots of different things. It's interesting to see behind the curtain, as we mentioned before, and see kind of like the thought process of some of these big companies and why they make the decisions they do and the directions that they're wanting to go.
And none of the cons would probably be too expensive. You know what I'm saying?
Isn't that crazy?
Money was not an issue.
Yeah. Not one bit.
Well, I mean, all of these studios, at least individually, probably all would have been way cheaper than just buying ZeniMax. So, I mean, it's not, it makes sense. It's like, if you got the money to drop on ZeniMax, and now clearly they've got the money that they're willing to try to buy Activision and Blizzard, money's not an object for Microsoft.
If Sony can afford it, Microsoft definitely could afford it.
Yes. Microsoft could afford 10 of them.
That's right.